Bonsoir à tous. I'm Joey Côté-Rancourt, co-creator in sustainability with Joshua Jensen at the back. Thank you all for being there at this lecture, Shadow Collection, Chemical Intimacy in the Museum and Archive by Kirsty Robertson, winner of the 2024 Research in Visual Art Award at the Grantham Foundation. We would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded indigenous land. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodian of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home of a diverse population of indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connection with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationship with Indigenous and other people with the Montreal community. For the FOFA Gallery, this means an ongoing work in protecting and preserving this land. Before I introduce our guests, I would like to briefly invite you all to our next show at the gallery. Show's called Fil Conducteur. It's an exhibition on contemporary Indigenous beadwork by artists Carrie Allison, Catherine Boyer, Bev Koski, John Marshall, and Nico Williams. As you may already have seen, the vitrine just outside this amphitheater present the beauty and skilled craftsmanship of the artists presented in this exhibition, each embodying solidarity and resistance through their work. The show will be open from March 17 to May 23rd, and our vernissage is next Thursday, March 20th from 5 to 7 p.m. And now for the event that brought us all together tonight, I'll just do a little introduction of the talk and the presentation of Kirsty. So, Shadow Collection, Chemical Intimacies in the Museum and Archive by Kirsty Robertson. Museums are often described as pristine and neutral place, carefully controlled temperature and humidity levels, and the filtration of unwanted particle and pollution from gallery environment. As museum neutrality has come to be challenged, so too should any notion of the pristine museum space. This research develops a theory of the shadowy, feral underside of collection, focusing on toxic and chemical elements that often invisibly accompany material objects. Those challenge the idea of the museum purity and profoundly impact the use, display, as well as the repatriation of documents, artifacts, artworks, and belongings. This talk reflects on how the Shadow Collection warps linear model of time and permanence in the museum. And now a little presentation of Kirsty. She's a leading figure in the field of sustainability curating and the 2024 Research in Visual Arts Award. She is a Canada Research Chair in Museum Art and Sustainability and Professor and Director of Museum and Curatorial Study in the Department of Visual Arts at Western University, where she also directs the Center of Sustainable Curating. Robertson has published widely on activism, visual culture, and museum, culminating in her book, Tear Gas Epiphanies, Protest Culture Museum. In her new work focuses on small and micro collection that repurpose traditional museum format for critical and political radical projects. Robertson is a founding member of the Synthetic Collective, a group of artists, scientists, and cultural researchers working on plastic pollution in the Great Lakes region, and project co-led on a museum for future fossils, an ongoing vernacular museum that responds curatorially to ecological crisis. As a co-curator in sustainability, I'm delighted to welcome Kirsty Robertson for this lecture. She has been a valuable collaborator in her efforts towards sustainability, and her writing, along with her ongoing work with the Center for Sustainable Curating, continue to be a vital resource, shaping both research and activism in the field. Kirsty will be speaking for about 45 minutes, and we'll have time for questions at the end. The talk will be in English, mais les questions en français sont la bienvenue. Thank you to the Grantham Foundation for the co-hosting of this event with us, and thank for the Faculty of Fine Arts for their support and the CDA for technical assistance. Just after the talk, we'll have a little reception just outside on the marble table, so stick around. And now I think we have a little word from the Grantham Foundation. Oh, yes? Okay.
Good evening. I really hope that there is someone here who does not know the Grantham Foundation, because everything that I'm going to say is going to be already known. Does anyone doesn't know the Grantham Foundation? Oh, I love you all. Okay, so we already know that it's thanks to FOFA and to the Grantham Foundation for the Arts and the Environment that we have the opportunity to hear Western University professor Kirsty Robertson this evening. Her lecture flows in part from her month-long residency at the Grantham Foundation as the 2024 recipient of the Research Residency Grant in Visual Art. The Grantham Foundation is first and foremost a place where artists and researchers can reflect and work. Its co-founders, Bernard Landriot and Michel Paradis, who are here with us tonight, have a dual goal. First is to support the creation of visual arts and the study of art and architecture as they relate to today's environmental challenges. And second, to ensure the dissemination and visibility of its activities focusing on school children, students, and seniors. Each year, the Foundation awards 2 grants in visual arts, 1 each in creation and research, and 1 in architecture. The call for projects for 2026 has just been launched. The Grantham Foundation is located in a wooded area in Saint-Edmond-de-Grantham, a very, very well-known municipality in the center du Québec. But for those who don't know Grantham, it's near Drummondville. I invite you to visit at the Foundation's site to inform yourself on its many, many wonderful endeavors. And why not plan a visit to the Foundation when it offers public events. Thank you. And
So thank you so much for coming, and I'd especially like to thank Fondation Grantham and FOFA Gallery for hosting this event and also hosting me for a month last summer, a beautiful, wonderful month last summer, and for FOFA for continuing our collaboration around issues of sustainability in the gallery and museum. So the work I'm going to talk to today, I'll say in advance that it's a little messy, and I thought about tidying it up a bit, and then I thought, well, these issues are pretty messy, so there's no way to kind of have one outcome when you think about chemical externalities in the museum. So I left it as like a series of little snippets that are sort of tied together. And some of it is depressing, and some of it is funny, and some of it is depressing. But we'll see. So I'd like to begin this talk with a film still from a very recent film produced by Hauser and Wirth for their 2024 retrospective on sculptor Eva Hesse. And Hesse, who was known for her work in fiberglass and latex and other newly introduced industrial materials, a lot of which she would buy from the construction industry stores in New York City, is shown smiling at the camera and washing some wire in a bathtub. And the wire, which eventually became the central component of this work, which is called metronomic irregularity, is actually lined with asbestos. And in the 1960s, when she was making the work, asbestos was known as a naturally occurring fibrous silicate mineral that made an excellent thermal and electrical insulator. So it's been around for centuries, and its toxic properties, which through the inhalation of fibers can lead to a variety of cancerous and non-cancerous diseases, are now well known. But the dangers of asbestos were actively suppressed until the 1980s, and it's only a hazard when it's in movement. So when abrasions set the thin fibrous crystals in motion, they can be inhaled and then they get caught in the lungs. And once they're caught in the lungs, they build up scarring or fibrosis and eventually can lead to death. So washing asbestos in the bathtub is a very bad idea, but one that she wouldn't have known at the time was dangerous. So Eva Hesse died of a brain tumor when she was 34, and it's very tempting to link her use of industrial materials to her death, but this is not actually how the toxic properties of asbestos and other chemical plasticizers work. So Hesse's tumor was almost certainly the result of a genetic predisposition, completely unrelated to chemical exposure, while the unfolding impacts of asbestos and similarly toxic chemicals have completely different timelines. So the negative health outcomes of asbestos inhalation, for example, are often experienced decades after contact, while many endocrine disrupting chemicals that migrate to the surfaces of plastics and other synthetic materials that were popular in the experiments of the 1960s, they nestle in reproductive systems and they epigenetically pass on their impacts to future generations. So they're not necessarily experienced as adverse in the moment. So Eva Hesse's sculptures are well known for their visible degradation. The materials that she was using have discolored and they've changed from transparent and flexible to milky yellow and deep amber. And they've simultaneously become dried and brittle and cracked. And the speed with which Hesse's small but important body of work has degraded has presented a number of conservation challenges. And these are often grouped around whether the very real optical changes, which you can see here, doesn't mean that this is still the same work that Hesse made in 1969, or has it changed so fundamentally that a replica should be considered for display. So if that is the case, which has happened in the display of her work, the original works become this category known as non-art. So they're non-art artworks. They're effectively retired and kind of separated from the name of the artist. So these are really fascinating discussions. And conservator Anne Temkin's work is very central here. But my interest in this talk lies in these two separate but intertwined timelines. So on the one hand, there's the very rapid degradation of the work and the change in the work. And then on the other hand, there's this very slow unfolding of the toxic properties of the work, which may not be recognized for several generations. So I'm just putting this up as some of my main sources, including Heather, who was also one of the Grantham awardees a couple years before me, and is also a member of Synthetic Collective. Oh, and is also part of the project that I'm going to describe in a moment. So museums are often described as pristine spaces, and this is part of the supposed neutrality of the museum. So this was in my description of this talk. So museums are, one of their roles is to stop and intervene in the action of time on artworks. That's considered like part of what the museum does. But as museum neutrality has come to be challenged in many, many ways, I want to challenge also the way that the kind of chemical properties of artworks also challenge any idea that an artwork can be unchanging or static, or that it should be considered as something that can always be pristine and unchanging. So the challenges of the neutral museum space the neutral museum space can be challenged by examining the feral underside of the collections and focusing on the toxic and chemical elements that often invisibly accompany material objects like Hesse's metronomic irregularity. And my argument is the way that many new materials degrade in combination with the slow unraveling of embodied impacts demands a rethinking of the durational beingness of degrading artworks and their enmeshment and their transmission to the world around them. So both timelines provide evidence for what Jessica Cooley, in a recent and paradigm-shifting article, celebrates as crypt materiality. So this is a rethinking of inherent vice. And what inherent vice is the propensity of materials to break down over time. So she takes inherent vice and turns it on its head, instead suggesting that celebrating the material conditions of art, including what she calls their material non-compliance, opens the door to a more inclusive art world. So I love this argument, and this is a work by Claes Oldenburg made from polyurethane that is literally oozing into a pile of stuff. Jessica Cooley uses this to ask why these kinds of works aren't celebrated for what they are and for their materiality, so that the oozing polyurethane should be considered part of the artwork, when in fact this artwork was, like the Eva Hesse ones I was describing, it was retired and became part of a teaching collection. So I love that celebration of material non-compliance, but I want to hold it beside an idea that some of the synthetic materials that are degrading like this additionally hold the potential to instigate and catalyze hormonal disruptions that can lead to further autoimmune disorders and lowered fertility rates. And this is part of what Heather Davis refers to as an entanglement with toxic kin. So my own stance is both and. I follow Cooley in foregrounding the importance of material noncompliance, while also advocating for better understanding of the potential toxic properties of degradation, so as to create safer environments for all. So I really feel like both of those can be held together. So thinking about the lives of materials both plays with and parallels the past-future nexus of art collections, and builds on Rubio's, that was the book I showed, this book, Fernando Domingo Rubio's challenge to the fiction of permanence in art objects. So he points to the extensive labor that goes into making famous artworks appear static and unchanging. But we can extend this to think about how certain artworks enmesh themselves into the bodies of audience members and caretakers through, for example, the inhalation of microfibers or off-gassing chemicals. And then we can use that to better understand and maybe respond to the environments that we live in every day. So a starting point. In 2023, I was part of a residency with the Center for Sustainable Curating and the Synthetic Collective in concert with the European-based Sustainable Institution Project to find more sustainable models for art display, storage, and conservation. And there's a couple people here who are also part of this project. So the project focused on developing a set of contract riders that could be used by artists who wanted to allow their work particularly work that contained organic elements, to embrace change and degrade on a timescale that corresponded with the lifespan of the material. So this could be weeks or months rather than decades or centuries. And the intervention was needed for many reasons, but our initial approach was tied with helping artists and collecting institutions to reframe or reimagine the lifespan of certain artworks through sustainability. So the illusion of a timeless artwork is one that can be extremely extractive of energy and materials. And the project that emerged from the residency was called Objects as Temporal Entities, and it's open access and available at this QR code. But I'll just tell one story as it intersects with this talk. So the work on Objects as Temporal Entities took place at Atelier Luma in France, in a space that employs sustainable design techniques to foreground its project of bioregionalism. So they use the waste from the agricultural industry around them to create sustainable design and healthy building techniques. And the atelier where we were located is part of Luma Arles, which is a major gallery. And while we were in residence, there was a show on by the film director turned artist Agnes Varda. And this show included 600 kilograms of potatoes. The show is called Patatutopia, and it celebrates her love of the humble potato. And then in one room, there's this triptych film, and in front of the film, there's 600 kilograms of potatoes, about a quarter of which you can see here. So because we knew the potatoes had been acquired locally, and because they fit with our project to better understand how the lifespan of various organic and inorganic materials in the museum, we asked if we could work with a potato from the Agnes Varda set, and the answer was yes. So there are a number of artists who work with potatoes, and even more who work with food and plants and other organic materials. So in a few cases, like works by Dieter Roth and Zoe Leonard, the decomposition of the organic matter kind of is the work. But for most cases, the vegetable matter is replaced with each showing. And sometimes, as in the case of the 600 kilograms of potatoes, these were replaced monthly throughout the showing of the work. And this was because the gases produced by decomposing potatoes create really noxious environments. If you've ever smelled a rotting potato, you can imagine what 600 kilograms would smell like just horrible. And they're usually not poisonous, but they can be poisonous in the right conditions. So this was too much for security guards who were working daily in the space, as well as for audiences who would be visiting for less time. So even though the potatoes were just potatoes from a local farm, removing one, even with permission, was extremely nerve-wracking. And maybe something had happened to the potato that made it art. I don't know, but in any case, the message so I was there with one other person, and the message that we were artists and scholars in residence and had been given permission to remove the potato had not moved down the chain of command. So I plucked 2 potatoes from the display, and we were immediately surrounded by docents, by a very confused family, by security guards, and by a fire marshal who just happened to be there. So everyone was shouting in multiple languages, and I was waving my phone around with the email that said we could take the potato. It was extremely chaotic. And then the fire marshal pushed everybody aside, and he yelled like he was imploring us, please put the potato back. They've been treated. They're poisonous. You have to return the potato and wash your hands. So everything stopped. And what did we take with us when we removed these particular potatoes from the Varda exhibition? So art in collections tends not to be treated with chemical pesticides and fire retardants. The same is not true for curtains and carpets and furnishing in museums. And this is a relatively accepted division. So the application of chemicals to art is usually avoided because the chemical treatments could alter the work or impact the artist's conceptual intent. So I paused with this illicit potato in my hands, which was potentially covered in fire retardants or forever chemicals, wondering what to do. So was or was not the potato part of the artwork? If it was the art, it likely wouldn't have been treated. And if it was an addition to the art, it likely would have been treated. So I almost put it back. But then I thought about how before I had taken the potato, I had sat on a chair in the gallery, which had definitely been treated with fire retardants. I had run my fingers over a vinyl wall covering. I had walked on the synthetic carpets, again, that had almost certainly been treated with a stain guard. And we were breathing in the fumes of a newly painted wall. So we were surrounded by the same chemicals that on the potato were treated as extraordinary. So later I wondered if the fire marshal had been afraid that I was going to eat the potato, which is like an arty way of consuming art. Like, I do think that's what he thought. But in fact, we didn't put the potato back. We were allowed to leave. The potato became a major component, a major seed of the project objects as temporal entities. And it remains in a liminal space of art, not art, an unknown whether or when it might have been coated in chemical fire retardants. So what of that chaotic moment? So on the left, these are the original potatoes. One of them rotted, one of them sprouted, and it became, you can see it in the cover of this risograph publication. And there are many other parts of that project that are filtered through potatoes. And on the right is the potato recently in February 2025. So in Lotte Arndt's article, Poisonous Heritage from 2022, she notes the widespread practice of treating wood, cloth, and paper with chemical treatments, which is a practice that really only ended in the 1980s. And this includes many belongings taken or looted during colonial times. So the organic materials of many masks, regalia, papers, and even ancestral remains were vulnerable to mold and insects, which prompted the use of pesticides and herbicides that were themselves crucial parts of colonial extractive systems and chemical warfare. So Arndt asks, does the presence of toxic substances in ethnological collections that have sedimented through decades of conservation practices perpetuate the consequences of the object's transformation in European museums? What happens when contaminated cultural goods are repatriated? Can a poisonous past impose obstacles to the opening of collections to stakeholders who claim access? Arndt points out that the liberal use of biocides within ethnographic collections was deeply tied with post-war notions of progress that foregrounded the chemical industry as a net positive, particularly in a Europe devastated by the impacts of war. The widespread use of chemicals, among them mercury and arsenic, but also DDT and Zyklon, which are both infamous for their use in the mass murder of humans as well as plants and animals, they were all used as treatments to prolong the lifespan of wood and textiles in collections. It's a point that Arndt spends some time considering. What does this residual toxic legacy mean for the protection of heritage? decontamination is difficult or impossible and expensive. And so the inheritance of chemical misuse has to be stored and cared for alongside artifacts. So Arndt's research concentrates on European museums, but her point is very much brought home through the work of Alutiiq artist Tanya Lueken-Linklater and her 2019 video work and amplification through many minds. So in the film work, Lueken-Linklater creates a choreography of gesture, listening, and touch for visiting the vaults of the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology in Berkeley, California, where many belongings made by her ancestors are stored in museum conditions. In the film, 3 dancers move through the space, bringing life and breath back to shift the atmospheric conditions of the museum, while also acting as a kind of restorative justice for the objects sleeping or resting in storage. But the dance is interrupted with scenes of Lueken-Linklater in a storage space where belongings have been carefully laid out. In most of the scenes, she is wearing nitrile gloves, and it is revealed that many of the objects in collection have been treated with arsenic and mercury to prevent infestation. A tactile relationship is always prevented, and the sheath of contamination not only makes skin contact unadvisable, but as curator Clementine Delis warns, chemicals have an impact on future modes of use, including the risk of prolonging the museumation of objects in showcases and their presentation at a distance, behind ropes and alarms. In this sense, toxicity prolongs the separation of people and objects, first put in place by imperial collecting. So research into toxic substances in ethnographic collections, in taxidermy, which often used arsenic, and in science, technology, and medical collections, which I'll get into a little bit more. They are all unsettling. And as Delis notes, they're used to prevent access and to extend the moment of removal. It's a really important point. The presence of hazardous chemicals is actively used to prevent access. And I want to hold that point while also acknowledging that simultaneously, the presence of toxins is often unknown. And so the people impacted actually don't know what they are working with. So for example, decades and centuries of building hierarchies between art and non-art have wrapped some art production in a veil of secrecy. So treatments cannot always be shared, and more to the point, materials lists are often incomplete, particularly with regard to artworks that use found objects or found materials. What might migrate to the surface of artworks over time is often unknown or not well understood. So on the one hand, the tiny toxic hazards, as M. Murphy calls them, are widely present in composite materials that are used in the building industry, so they're in the unremarkable interiors of our daily lives. But on the other hand, the presence of hazardous and dangerous substances in remarkable artworks creates a really peculiar and almost always unacknowledged question of what it actually is that museums are collecting. So embedded in many artworks are the chemical histories of the 20th and 21st centuries, and their histories suffused with chemicals. So formaldehyde, lace, plywood sheets, PVC vinyl, crumbling polyurethane, Teflon, cadmium and cathode rays, PCBs, I could go on and on. So as chemicals migrate to the surfaces through processes of microcrazing or off-gassing, they sometimes make themselves known and they sometimes remain invisible. But either way, once they're collected, they enter the collecting institution's efforts to ward off the passage of time. So art is, to quote Heather Davis again, not an escape from toxicity, but rather a reckoning with its permeation. So holding the potato in my hands, its humbleness and the mundaneness of chemical treatments, I did wonder about our intertwined futures. So I want to think here for a moment with the potato, minus its chemical sheath, if it existed, we still don't know. The original impetus of the work that we were doing was to imagine the future of some artworks in collection as more akin to compost. So of artworks that were allowed to decay. So a number of environmentally conscientious artists are increasingly incorporating biomaterials or natural materials into their artworks. And these low impact materials offer sustainable pathways to artwork production and presentation, but a lot of them specifically change and degrade, sometimes in hours, much less weeks or months. So this is a work called Plasticity, and it's made by New York-based Canadian artist Gwyneth Chow. And she actually provided a lot of feedback on the project, so it's like nice to include her here. So her work uses kitchen sink bioplastics, which are made from tapioca starch, water, glycerin, and vinegar. So they look like plastics and they act like plastics, but they biodegrade quickly. So the work is made by forming a bioplastic carapace over plastic household objects and then removing the original plastic vessel. It's a very time-consuming process, and the work is done in the gallery so that it becomes about the process of making these vessels. And by the end of the show, the molds that are made early in the show's run have completely changed color and shape. So time is present through the decay of the work. And these exhibitions end with her composting the vessels. So I love ephemeral work like this. I love like thoughtful work like this. And I know I'm not alone in this because the art world is replete right now with works that are like this. And often the end result is not a composting of the work, but an effort to make the work endure beyond the capacities of the materials that are used to make it. So the Getty Conservation Institute recently published a book titled Living Matter, which includes, among other things, strategies for displaying, collecting, and conserving works made from fruits and vegetables, eggshells, cake, seaweed, mycelium, breast milk, skin, and mold. And there's a definite issue in collecting works like this because the underlying premise of the art world right now is that the work shouldn't dissolve in a couple of weeks. So when they are collected, often what is collected is surrogate documentation, so photos or videos of the work, something that might be more like a recipe or a set of instructions, or the preventative conservation effort actually almost becomes the artwork. So the way of making it endure replaces what the artwork actually is. And this is a pretty extreme example. So Pieces of the People We Love, a 2007 work by Adrian Villar-Royas, which uses a sponge cake baked by his aunt. And the work was acquired by Moderna Musik in Stockholm, and the cake was already 13 years old when the work was acquired, and it had been stored by his parents in their, I don't even think in the fridge, they just had it. And then the museum, he's a famous artist, so the museum probably paid a significant amount of money to acquire this work. And now because there's this monetary investment in it, they want to acquire the work and its future. And so the work has been placed in an anoxic chamber, which means an oxygen-free chamber, to suspend it in this place outside of time. So it is not allowed to decay any further because it has gone from a work that was, stored by his parents to a work that now has cultural import. So think what you will of this work, but I'm going to turn to the final section of this talk to talk about Mylar and PCBs, and I want to hinge it on a few points. So the first is that all materials are time-based entities. They all change and they all decay, and sometimes the time scales at which that takes place are surprising. Second, from a sustainability angle, it is usually better to keep intervention relatively minimal. And number three, the point or the use of the word usually in my previous point is doing a lot of work, because artworks are seldom discrete objects, and the manner in which they break down can have multiple consequences for the people and other objects around them. So works like Gwyneth Chow's and many others using living or natural materials are frequently resisted by galleries because they can attract insects or produce mold. But I suggest that those concerns should be seen as part of a spectrum of degradation in the lifespan of artworks that have tended to be seen as persisting. So I'm going to argue that plastic artworks are not so different from artworks made from cake. That's what I'm going to suggest. This is a person whose work I draw on a lot, Hannah Halling. She's an art historian, and I just really like this quote. All works have durations, whether short or long, and we come to the understanding of artworks as tethered not only to a specific materiality, but also to a specific temporality. So Mylar. This is the work that I was thinking about the most when I was in Grantham. And there was no Mylar. It's a very common material, but there's no Mylar in the Fondation. So originally invented by DuPont in the 1950s, Mylar is one of the trade names for biaxially oriented polyethylene terephthalate, which is a polyester film made from stretched polyethylene, or PET, that is then sandwiched between aluminum. Mylar can be transparent, but it is often metallicized, and so it's sandwiched between sheets of aluminum to which it is bonded. It's a very common material. It's probably most familiar from helium balloons or the blankets handed out at the end of marathons. And it's frequently used in food packaging because it's near impermeable to gases, which grant the food a long shelf life. So a moment of comedy, because I've been, pulling out some depressing things. It may be familiar from the packaging of Oreo cookies. And I draw attention to this because Oreo undertook an ad campaign a few years ago in 2020, I think, where they apparently built a miniature Svalbard seed vault, which was designed to hold packages of Oreo cookies for future generations in the event of an asteroid hitting the Earth or any other apocalypse. So this was the ad campaign. So as an added precaution, the Oreo packs are wrapped in Mylar, which can withstand temperatures from minus 80 degrees to 300 degrees Fahrenheit and is impervious to chemical reactions, moisture, and air, keeping the cookies fresh and protected for years to come. So this is not real. It was a very effective ad campaign, and the claims they are making about Mylar are probably true. Like, if you did wrap cookies in Mylar and put them in Svalbard, they probably would last for centuries. So Mylar also reflects light effectively, and because of this, it's used as the top layer of Polaroid prints, and it is radiation resistant and offers good temperature control, meaning that it effectively made space travel possible. So most satellites are coated in Mylar, and Mylar is also now very noticeable in scenes of disaster. So mylar blankets scatter the beaches of the European Mediterranean, where they've been used by migrants who have made the dangerous crossing. So mylar is also an extremely popular material in the art world. It was popularized when Buckminster Fuller used it as the skin on one of his early geodesic domes. And it then achieved a near mythical status in Andy Warhol's Silver Clouds, which you see here. This work was created in 1964 through a collaboration with electrical engineer Billy Kluver. And it's made from filling floating metallic or mylar pillows with a proprietary mixture of regular air and pure helium. And the whole point of the work is that the balloons have enough lift to get off the floor, but not so much that they stick to the ceiling. So it's like quite a process to make them. And when the work is shown, which it's still shown frequently, the mylar balloons are replaced once a week so that they don't weaken or leak. But this work was made possible because Kluver had been working with NASA. And at NASA, he learned about mylar and then saw its possibilities for a material of interest to artists. So I'm interested in this NASA link because the Smithsonian collection of Apollo spacesuits provides a really great test case for better understanding what happens to mylar and other materials like it over time. The Apollo spacesuits are among the most popular artifacts held by the Smithsonian, which really makes them some of the most popular elements anywhere. And they're fascinating because of their link to the embodied experience of being in space. And at the time of their making, they were the most advanced combination of chemical and physical engineering. And what was necessary was the creation of, this is a quote from the space program, a little envelope of Earth conditions featuring complete insulated coverage and complete atmospheric pressurization, which would allow for survival on the 93°C, no oxygen, low gravity surface of the moon. But the suits were made in the 1960s before anyone had been to the moon, and designers were faced with like more unknowns than anything else. Would the astronauts just sink in the moon dust? That was a very real concern. How hot and windy would it be? How many layers of protection were necessary? Would the astronauts leave the craft and immediately be hit with microasteroids or radiated on the spot? And when design began, many of the materials that were eventually used, they hadn't been invented yet. And curator Douglas Lantry, who's in charge of some of the suits, he tells this like possibly apocryphal story where if a design required a miracle substance that did not exist, they substituted the imaginary all-purpose unavailabilium until the right material could be found or made. So one of those materials was mylar, and it was an essential part of the 21 layers of synthetic fabrics that went into each spacesuit. So it's sandwiched in between every other layer. And Lantry continues, each Apollo spacesuit was constructed by hand with sewing machines, single needles, glue, and heat sealing tools, and every spacesuit was made by a group of women who were working in Delaware. So I can't state enough that there was inherent and almost overwhelming belief in the possibilities of synthetics in the space program. And even those who did face any health outcomes from the making of the spacesuits were still kind of enraptured by what they were doing. And there's this kind of line of comments that the smell of plastics is the smell of progress, like they're kind of folded together. So the spacesuits would seem to have very little in common with Gwyneth Chow's bioplastic or the cake in Adrienne Villarroya's work. But in fact, the rates of degradation of tapioca paste and of many synthetic polymers are not that dissimilar. And the cake, in fact, before it was stored, massively outlasted the spacesuits. So within a few years of being acquired, the Apollo spacesuits were showing signs of wear. And by 1999, so this is 30 years after Neil Armstrong walked on the moon, conservator Amanda Young noted that the flown suits, which means they'd been to space, were showing significant signs of degradation. So some are stiff, brittle, shrunken, discolored, or have crumbling or sticky parts because of the unpredictable effects of time and environment on the wide array of modern synthetic materials. So unlike the decay of tapioca starch and cake, the degradation of the spacesuits was completely unexpected. It had been assumed that synthetics were forever, and in a sense they are, because the vegetable matter will biodegrade while the synthetics just break down into smaller components, and they become harder and harder to track. So it had been deeply expected that there would not be any changes in the spacesuits, and writing almost 30 years after the first issues with the Apollo spacesuits were noted, conservator Yvonne Shashua, who wrote the central text on conserving plastics, she noted that the conservation of plastics was not recognized as a need in museums until the 1990s, and that until the first decade of the 2000s, the field was replete with what she calls plastics denial syndrome, which was just a refusal to admit that plastics in collections were unstable. So of the suits, conservator Ed McManus wrote, quite naturally, spacesuits designed to operate under such harsh conditions and with zero tolerance for failure were considered indestructible. Unfortunately, time has proven these objects to be far from that. Virtually all of the spacesuits in our collection display the unfavorable effects of oxidation and deterioration. The rubber, neoprene, and plastic parts have broken down in complex processes of polymer degradation that involve their softening, discoloring, and deforming or flowing. Trade secret rubber mixes have separated like oil and water, sweating, becoming sticky, and affecting adjacent fabrics. Clearly, the suits were strong but short-lived. So the plastics and the new synthetic materials, they're just replete with unknowns. The suits were originally stored in cold storage, and this is the usual treatment for textiles like wool and fur. But the cold storage actually sped up the crystallization of the rubber elements of the suits, and then that had a cascading effect on most of the other materials. So in addition to that, many of the materials in the suits are to this day unknown. They are the unavailabilium that they were filled in as needed, but they were sort of like last minute additions. Many of the companies have gone out of business. They lost or destroyed the historical recipes for the textiles, and they refused to share proprietary information. And on top of that, many of the suits are incomplete. So in the moon image, you can see the footprints, but the boot coverings that made the famous footprints were actually left on the moon. And the reason for that is because they wanted room in the console to bring back lunar samples. So the lunar samples are in the museums, And many sites on the moon are considered to be of heritage importance, but the moon can't be owned by any nation. So there are all sorts of additional things around the things that were left on the moon. In any case, when the moon suits came back, they were also covered in moon dust, and whether or not to preserve the dust is like also an important part of this conversation. So you have plasticizers migrating up to the surface of the suits, making them sticky, and dust in the surrounding environment gets glued to the surface. And how do you distinguish that from the moon dust, which is special? So anyway. The Apollo spacesuits very effectively demonstrate an issue with all plastics. So this is Yvonne Shishua again. So in general, plastics have an induction period, which follows manufacture, during which no physical or chemical changes can be detected. And that's followed by a period during which irreversible damage can be observed and measured. The shift from induction to degradation is often very brief. And once initiated, degradation of plastics cannot be prevented, reversed, or stopped. It can only be inhibited or slowed. So obviously this has major implications for things like the spacesuits or trying to preserve any kind of plastic-based artwork or artifact in pristine condition. It also has effects that we're now seeing in the environment where plastics are clearly degrading. And when they were invented, this was not really thought of as the final life cycle. But to my mind, these two are very intimately connected. So work continues on the Apollo spacesuits, and it's primarily been supported through a 2015 Kickstarter campaign that the Smithsonian ran to raise $1 million. But as a corollary, the conservation research has impacts for figuring out what happens to plastics in the wild. And there are a number of reasons why I was particularly attracted to Mylar when looking at these suits. So this is, Julian Cherrier is an artist, but I really like what he says here. He says aluminum, but that's actually Mylar. So importantly, Mylar film, when it's uncoated, so when it doesn't have the aluminum coating in it, it's very stable and its induction period is lengthy. And because of this, the uncoated Mylar is used extensively in museum storage, primarily as envelopes and wrapping. So it remains transparent over time, and it's apparently inert, although with all plastics, we never know. So the futures of plastics are always unproven and uncertain. But the addition of surface coatings like aluminum, which make it attractive to artists and engineers, undermine the stability of the PET core of Mylar. And in the spacesuits, the PVC hosing and the rubber fastenings are causing the most visible damage. But the Mylar that is between all those, sandwiched between all those other fabrics, it's delaminating. So the aluminum is coming off the PET parts of it. And as soon as that happens, the aluminum turns to dust. You've probably seen this happen with helium balloons. When the aluminum turns to, you get this like colorful dust off the top of the balloon, and then underneath the PET shape of the balloon is still visible. So aluminum is not a good thing to have in the environment. There's already prevalent aluminum overexposure and toxicity. And the process of breakdown is vastly sped up by the presence of humidity or water. Like if you see balloons in water, it's a problem. So the spacesuits were thought to be eternal, but they degraded so quickly that their shocking breakdown essentially changed thinking about the lifespan of plastics overall, as well as synthetic textiles and other materials. So the migration of plasticizers to the surface and the embrittlement and breakage of synthetic materials, it's part of a broken cycle. It's a constantly failing attempt to biodegrade and return to source, but that's always impossible. So the consequences of this form the atmospheres in which we live. So I have one last example that's like much shorter, because there's maybe unfortunately less to say about it. But this is the presence of polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, which are organochlorine compounds that were formerly used in industrial and consumer electronic products. So they're persistent chemicals in that they don't break down easily on their own, and they're difficult to clean up and destroy. So trace levels of PCBs were first noted in the Great Lakes, and that was in the 1960s, and they're now present all over the world. And trace levels are not considered to be of concern, but PCBs accumulate in the body, and they're potentially carcinogenic, or they act as hormone disruptors. So all Canadians are exposed to PCBs through air, soil, water, and food. And the manufacture of PCBs was globally banned in 2001, but they continue to make their way into environments primarily through e-waste breakdown, and actually also through microplastics as plastics break down. So there's almost certainly PCBs lurking in artworks, because artworks that maybe contain fluorescent light capacitors or electronic components that were manufactured in the 1970s, or carbonless copy paper. There's also certain kinds of paint, so they're like definitely there. But where I want to look at is science and technology collections, because there's a really interesting thing that's happening right now. So here's the second timeline I want to look at. So if the first timeline is the breakdown of plastics into their chemical components very rapidly, the second timeline is this like extended and unknown timeline of persistent organic chemicals, which are also known as forever chemicals. So current rules in Canada mandate the decommissioning of goods and equipment that contain a concentration of PCBs greater than 50 milligrams per kilogram or 50 parts per million. So you'll see those numbers on this label, and I'll explain what this is in a second. So decommissioning is like actually extremely difficult. You can't just throw it out, and it's also very controversial. So essentially it means storing PCB-laden objects in special hazardous waste landfills. But where are those landfills, and who has to like deal with potential contamination? There's this other side to it, which is that Canadian heritage institutions hold numerous artifacts that contain PCBs. So these are like not art institutions, these are science and tech institutions. Under current regulations, they would have to dispose of all of those artifacts, and we're talking like thousands of things. So right now, like right this minute, extensive work is taking place to write an exception to Canadian law for the heritage sector. And under the proposed amendments, any concentration of PCBs would be permitted in objects of historical value if the PCBs are sealed within the item, and removal would destroy the item. So such items must already be part of the museum's collection at the time of the updated regulations. Fire suppression systems would be required in areas where PCB containing items are kept, because one of the main routes of transmission of PCBs is through fire and smoke. And museum operators would have to keep records and annually submit documentation to the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. making sure that their PCB-laden artifacts are properly stored. So in short, museums in Canada have asked for an exception to legislation to allow them to store the chemical heritage that accompanies many electronic devices, light bulbs, and other artifacts. This is not a straightforward task, so the storage of artifacts with PCBs has to take place very carefully, and they mostly can't be physically moved. So we're talking a kind of storage that is not a display storage, but is a kind of containment strategy. So the images that I have here, this is PCBs, and the next one is asbestos. To go back to Eva Hesse. These are images from the collections at the Canada Science and Technology Museum, where there is an effort to develop a trauma-centered approach to methods of collections management to make the spaces safer for conservators, curators, and other museum personnel. So in this museum in particular, curators and conservators care for artifacts that are radioactive, that contain PCBs, cadmium, heavy mercury, asbestos, and some of the hundreds of thousands of other chemicals introduced over the last century, many of which the impacts just aren't known. So an in-depth awareness of hazards as they pertain to the artifacts has become the kind of central organizing principle of collections there. And when I was visited, one of the conservators said to me, we've gone from the most dangerous collection in the world to one of the safest, because most of these objects were just kept on shelves for decades, and now they are properly stored, often, I'll say, wrapped in mylar. So there's a great quote by Mel Chen where they say, a toxin is toxic, but it also beckons. It often offers the only solutions we have to the problems we've created. So there's this process of replication. So to conclude and to open discussion, I want to bring back all of these moments. So Eva Hesse washing the wire in the bathtub and smiling, the potato in my hands in the gallery in France, the dancers in the gallery and Tanya Lucan Linklater being prevented from having a tactile relationship with her ancestors' belongings, Gwyneth Chow's changing bioplastic vessels, the degrading spacesuits, and the trauma-informed care at the Canadian Museum of Science and Technology. These all draw on M. Murphy's idea of what they call alter life, that we live in a world altered by its chemical relations, and also to draw out their notion of latency. So to be latent is to be not yet, a potential not yet manifest, a past not yet felt. Latency is the lag between exposure and effects within a regime of chemical reproduction, which necessitates a non-linear accounting of time. So the reaching to the past and the future complicates the endurance of gallery collections. Plasticizers and persistent organic chemicals like PCBs, they all look for pathways out. And we all store those microplastics and PCBs in our bodies. So we are all archives of 20th and 21st century chemical experimentation. So my goal is always to think about what this means for introducing more environmentally aware forms of making and displaying and maintaining art collections. And I suggest that both artworks and collections are processes. So they're always in constant movement. And the current work of artists and conservators and curators to consider letting go of the dominant paradigms of making collections involves acknowledging this shadowy, feral chemical uncertainties. So this is the potato, which persists against the odds in its total material non-compliance. And so, thank you.
know if there's any questions. Yeah.
I could probably just shout in it. It was just a curiosity one. Thank you for the talk, Kirsty. It's always fascinating. The zoom-ins of the PCB and the asbestos in the Science Museum, what are those objects?
Yeah, so I can't really tell you. Sorry. A lot of the PCB artifacts are from the oil industry, but those and the asbestos, it's often wiring. So this, I actually can't remember what this is, but wiring on lamps is often coated in asbestos. And a lot of museums like MoMA cuts off the wires of all of their designs so that they just don't have to deal with it, partly because of the asbestos potential, but also because the plastics that were used in the wires are very quick to degrade. So that's but PCBs are mostly in the science and tech collection in the industrial section of the collection. Yeah, sorry. I just didn't ask permission. And yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering, do you know how mylar became the kind of go-to enclosing material for that kind of protection? Like, is it because it's the most like stable? And I guess it's not the laminated kind, but
The aluminum kind or the
yeah, like it's not the aluminum kind, right?
yeah, I don't have a photo of it. It's hard, or it does have flexibility, but it's not crinkly.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it just became the go-to because it is acknowledged as being stable. And the way conservation usually works is that institutes like the CCI, the Canadian Conservation Institute, or the Getty will publish the results of their studies, and then museums will follow those studies because there's not a lot of work that can take place within the museums. So it's probably coming from CCI. And I have seen nothing that would detract from uncoated mylar being used as a stable material in museums. Yeah. Does that answer it? Yeah. Someone had the, yeah, Nicole?
If not, I'll try this one. I think it's kind of an uncooked question, but I've been thinking a lot, and most museums in this process of sort of rethinking, we must keep all the things forever all the time, like goes hand in hand with questions around deaccessioning and repatriation. And I've been thinking a lot about the collection I'm working with now, and there are works that, we're doing research to maybe send stuff back to Indigenous communities and co-belonging. On the other hand, we have a living artist who's been asking for their work back. It doesn't fit with the collection mandate. And half of me is like, let's just give the thing back. And then the other half of me, my responsibility as the curator, is to imagine the person, 100 years in the future, and to watch the kind of ebbs and flows of collections. The collection's full of things that at one point were not interesting to the people in the present moment that then become interesting later. So that reconciling of, I don't know where I'm going with this, but we're in a mode of relaxing around what museums can let go of, while at the same time trying to imagine a future where we don't know if the thing is going to be important or not. And I'm wondering how that kind of negotiation, like these questions around deaccessioning might come into the
I think I need to split it up.
Yeah.
Because like a lot of the work on, there's a ton of work taking place in the States on decontaminating belongings that could potentially be repatriated. So, but it's really difficult. So the issue is, if there is a collection of objects that were acquired in the 19th century, it has to be assumed that they're contaminated. And then because NAGPRA, which I'm not going to be able to remember what NAGPRA stands for, but NAGPRA is essentially the legislation in the US that controls the relationship that federal institutions in the US have with Indigenous people. And NAGPRA recently changed its rulings to essentially say that many, many more things should go back. And I think there was a lot of support for that, but then communities are also saying you can't give us back things that are potentially dangerous. So the work is being done, but of course there aren't enough funds for it, and they can't account for the harm that has taken place through treating sacred belongings with pesticides that kind of keep replicating that relationship. So in that case, I actually I found very little on Canada. So I'm not sure if those strategies were not used here or if it's simply unknown. But in terms of repatriation and giving things back, it has to be part of negotiations now where it simply wasn't before. So that's like one part of it. The other part is, I guess each institution is gonna make a decision on this because it is not an exaggeration to say the storehouses are overflowing. And in many cases, a more inclusive kind of collecting depends on making space for people who were not previously collected. What did you want me to talk about?
That's great. Yeah, I don't know where the question was in my thing either, but I think thinking about temporalities too, like responsibility to the present, to the past.
Oh,
to the
yes,
future,
okay.
Sort of thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if I have an answer because, like, I think the whole point is that even if something endures into the future, it's going to endure differently than it is in the current moment. And it is also going to incorporate the lifespan of the materials from which it was made. But what I would say is that many of the artworks that were made in the late 50s through the early 70s are now showing signs of degradation in ways that are maybe unattractive to the current way that museums understand showcasing their collections. So that, I mean, I think that's going to be pretty fascinating over the next decade. And then, okay, one other thing. In 30 years, when all of the artworks that were sold for exorbitant sums of money, when they start to break down, that's a completely different question, because if artwork is considered an investment and it costs $70 million and then it just turns into dust, I mean, what does that mean for the investment? So I think these questions are being actively debated in different ways by different people. The insurance community would want something totally different from the artists, and the collectors maybe want a spectrum of different things depending on what their goals were for the collections. But yeah, it's gonna be interesting.
I don't know how to say it in English, but is there also an ethical question related to all this, philosophical question related to all this? Where does ethics comes in?
Yeah, yes, I mean everywhere, because is it ethical to expose poorly paid conservators to materials we don't understand? Is it ethical to, you know, display an artwork that might harm the people looking at it? Is it I mean, is it ethical to live in a world that has been dominated by the production of chemicals with no consequence for the producers thinking about the end life of what they are producing? So there certainly are lots of conversations taking place around how any product should consider its full lifespan, from the materials that are extracted through to its dissolution into molecular compounds, but those are always up against profit making, essentially. So yeah, I always fall on the, we need to understand the ethics of these situations, because what is an art world without ethics? It's really, it's just a market, and that's not good for artists, or that's not good for anyone.